You know, kids' first exposure to so much of the world years ago was nature. And now it's shifted so much in the last 50 to 60 years that, you know, typically kids have more of an emotional connection with all those Game Boy or computer or iPhone. That's the thing that they've made the early childhood connection with, and then they have no idea about nature. And if you don't have any idea about nature, then you have no idea why it's important to save it, let alone about how to do that. Through the stories we tell our kids and the stories we tell ourselves, tell the kind of stories that inspire us to make that connection again.
Since 1970, we've lost 52% of the world's wild vertebrate animals. So we've lost 52% of our fish, birds, animals, amphibians, and reptiles.
Since what year?
Since 1970.
Wow. So in just like the last 40 years.
Right.
We've lost 52%.
Right. And so
like extinguished, like gone, extinct?
We've not, all the species have gone extinct, but their numbers are half.
This is a big deal.
This is a big deal. And instead of getting depressed about it, take action. You don't have to give up your job and move to the Amazon to save the Amazon rainforest. You can help the planet right where you live. Plant the native plants that are from your region in your yard to keep those numbers up.
On the west side of the hill, there really are a lot of Ceanothus up here.
You don't have to give up your job and move to the Amazon to save the Amazon rainforest. You can help the planet right where you live. Plant the native plants that are from your region in your yard to keep those numbers up. Help support the insects that feed the birds and the insects that feed the lizards. That's what we can do for positive action right where we live. 55% of land in the United States is devoted to urban and suburban uses.
The white Ceanothus.
Imagine if that 55% were planted with natives, that could all be habitat to bring back the birds, bring back the butterflies, use less water, create healthy, functioning ecosystems where we live.
Lots of it.
Instead of depending on little wild patchworks that are left, revitalize where we live with the native plants that make healthy, functioning food webs and ecosystems.
When you walk through the forest, have a plant ID for your own use.
We are hunter-gatherers attuned to recognizing and naming.
Exactly. It's a certain joy in recognition that gets at the origin of human language in terms of naming things and noticing things.
But then go home, grow those plants at home for butterflies and birds that the plants attract, instead of there just being more extraction of native plants that decreases their numbers. Grow habitat for those creatures. Let's increase the numbers. Let's make more. Plant out. Taxpayers pay millions of dollars every year to have invasive plants removed from the wildlands because many catch fires
That you'll find
are still sold by commercial nurseries. Pay millions of dollars every year to have invasive plants removed from the wildlands because many catch fires
that you'll find
are still sold by commercial nurseries.
Plant the plants that evolved in your region of the world, because those are the plants that know how to cope with all the conditions that you'll find. The biggest question I get when I do outreach is, do native plants make flowers? Yes, they make flowers like any other plants from any other part of the world. That's how they make more of themselves.
This definitely looks like a different Ceanothus.
I, like most people, just didn't know the difference between one weed and the other until I learned to forage weeds as edibles.
There's many different kinds of reasons for removing the invasive non-natives, and their culinary use is just one of them.
And when I did learn that, then when I took a walk around our neighborhood, it was like the whole sidewalk lit up. I was like, oh, look. Everything became individuated. Before it was just a moment of judgment, well, that person's got a weed yard. It brought plants to life when I was hiking. Then I started thinking, what are these things? It's always came from a selfish point of view. Now I'm the cult of selfish and what selfishness can do to engage people on an emotional level with these plants, as opposed to just getting, well, you better do it because, sort of a finger waving, like, we have to save the world, so you better plant that plant. Instead, it's like, look what you can do with this plant. Oh my God.
Right. We need to take, people's interest in these things for their own personal use and turn it into something that benefits society as a whole. There's 23 million people in Southern California, and we can't all turn into foragers again. When we think about the Native Americans, when they would tend the land, and there were so fewer number of the people then, they did it in a respectful way that it was sustainable. But now the impacts are trampling the existing habitat, degrading the soil, seed bank. The more people use it, the more they have to really adhere to a respectful being in the wild. When you have people that cut trails and take out plants, it's more than this ecosystem can sustain.
What impact have you seen from foraging regionally, foraging of native plants?
Well, what I've seen regionally is that areas in the Angeles National Forest, for instance, where people used to easily find stands of white sage, they aren't theirs anymore.
White sage makes the smudge sticks that have long been popular in the New Age community and in the witchcraft shops. I have the feeling I'm seeing more and more white sage smudge sticks everywhere. I go to our local health food store, there's a big pile of them. I see them in boutiques up and down Sunset Boulevard.
Tying that in with foragers' use of it, they are using it for more than much to cook game and meat. If people want the white sage, we should be farming it.
Be desired all over the country.
It's very much like lavender is part of Southern French ecosystem. They've made a whole industry out of distilling the lavender oil and growing, fields and fields and fields of lavender. I mean, it would be better not to grow a mono type of culture, and it would be better to have, mixed lands of plants, because then you get much health plants and you keep up a range of all kinds of pollinators and other species. But, we need to look at what the rest of the world has done with their native plant treasures and do that over here, instead of foraging in what little wildlands are left. If I want to consume the white sage, the golden currants, the buckwheat, then I should grow these plants wherever there's public spaces or private spaces that have already been taken over by people, in my yard or in my community garden or on church or synagogue grounds. Use those places to grow the plants and leave the wildlands intact, because there's so few of them left. What remains? When I moved to my house, it was flat lawn and thorny hedges of roses. And because the previous owners had sprayed to kill every spider, every cricket, every single week, there was just nothing living on the property besides the people in the house. So when we moved in, I started to kill the lawn. One of the very first plants that I planted was an elderberry tree. This tree is now, and it is a giant canopy of big clusters of tiny butter yellow flowers. From the moment they start to bloom in spring through midsummer, the butterflies come to nectar on those flowers. When they're pollinated, turn into clusters of elderberries, about 25 feet high and as wide. And then the birds that come from late summer through fall as the berries ripen over several months, it's amazing the life that I get in my yard because of that one tree. And if that tree weren't here, none of those insects and animals would be in my yard either.
Now, you told another story from that book you're working on before we started rolling, which was about what happened to a neighbor's yard, and which speaks to something about how we need to have a conversation with our neighbors. I wonder if you could recount that story.
Oh boy, well it's a sad story that's slowly having a better ending, but very, very slowly. So to the west of my house, my neighbor lived there. She was 95 years old when she died. And when she was about 70, she put in a native plant garden. So this was back in the mid-'80s or early '80s when there, was the drought of that period. And so she put in Palo Verdes and Manzanitas and Ceanothus, the native lilac, and all kinds of sage. And it was a beautiful yard and used very little water. And she had all kinds of hummingbirds and migratory birds and all kinds of butterflies there because because of coevolution, our insects and animals need the plants that are native because they co-evolved with them, and that's what most of them need in order to survive. So anyway, when my neighbor died at age 95, the new family moved in. And I was really worried about what was going to happen because there's mansionization happening all over the city where I live. And so I went over and I talked to the new neighbors and I said, you have a really special yard here. And so I asked them if I could give them a tour of their yard. And so I walked them through all the plants and I showed them pictures of the butterflies that each plant supported for larval food for the caterpillars. And, the plants that when their flowers were pollinated would make berries for the berry-eating birds. So I walked through their whole yard and, showed them everything and pictures of the plants in bloom and the plants in berry. And my neighbor's yard was nearly completely evergreen, so it was a beautiful yard. And long story short, what the new neighbors did is they bulldozed everything except for one native tree. And they installed 8,000 square feet of lawn, and their water bill went through the roof, and then their children came to play in my yard because my yard was where it was interesting. There were things happening, things buzzing around and flitting around, and lizards, and places to make little secret forts. And you can't do that in 8,000 square feet of lawn. It's just flat and sterile. And so when the neighbors' water bills went through the roof, then they came to me and said, oh dear, why didn't you, talk to us more forcefully about what we were getting into when we, were thinking about making a lawn here again?
Yeah, Lisa.
And I said, I should have been more fearsome with them.
Do you think that they put the lawn in because they had kids? That classic, we have kids, we have to have a lawn thing?
I think so, but the thing that people should do since they have kids is they should just put in a small patch of lawn. I mean, because it's nice to have a place to go and lay a blanket down on and stare up through the canopy of the elderberry tree and watch the butterflies and the birds. But it doesn't have to be 8,000 square feet.
Unless you're a soccer team or something like that.
Right. And then go to the park.
Right.
Well, this is something I puzzle on all the time because I have a deep love of native plants and a growing fascination with the biodiversity in our yard and with that growing passion comes kind of a growing horror of what I see around me. It's always it's a two-edged sword. The more you know, and the more the things they used to just ignore, like the neighbors with the yard that's entirely concrete or whatever, they used to just go, well, that's ugly. Now I see it as a great lost opportunity. And I wonder what, maybe I remember what was there before, or I imagine what could be there. And it's actually painful to see at this point, but I see that people have such a huge disconnect from nature that if you come like you did and you walk up to them and you say, look, the butterflies eat this plant, birds depend on the berries on this plant, when they're migrating or whatever, it just sort of seems to go in one ear and out the other, because that initial connection is not there.
Right.
And that is so it's very hard to make the argument to them that they should spend extra time and energy learning about native plants and adopting an entirely new aesthetic paradigm in their yards, when all most people can handle is the lawn and rose bush, because that's all they've ever seen and all they ever known, and the 10 minutes they're going to give to this decision can only encompass a lawn and a box hedge or something like that, so I don't know what I'm asking you. I'm voicing my own frustration, because we're always wondering how do we better communicate to our neighbors? Is there anything we can do on the neighborhood level to help our neighbors introduce more native plants into their landscape? How do we fight what I call the cult of tidiness? Where nothing's more important than having a tidy yard. Like, as if tidiness is our highest aspiration as humans, and so the end game with tidiness is all concrete that's regularly blown, the bare dirt that's swept clean, so God forbid a leaf could ever lay on the bare dirt.
Stories are essential, because that's what people have. The insects and animals have evolved with the plants and need the plants. People evolved with stories for millions of years. Stories for group cohesion, stories for group survival, and stories to celebrate things that are important in life. My book is about not only how we've changed the nature of LA, how we've come in and erased the landscape and put in all of these non-native plants that for the most part just devastate the ecosystem. And then it's also about how we as humans need to change our nature to once again be more in tune with the nature of our place and become part of it and become stewards, so that we're a benefit to where we live instead of a hindrance to the life that also makes this their home or tries to make this their home as well as us. So in terms of trying to turn the ship and trying to connect with people so that they are inspired, I think stories are hugely important for articulating what's possible. And then I also think that it's really important just to get in as many maintained native gardens as possible throughout the city, in public spaces, in schools, just so that people start to see this as an everyday part of their lives. And I really believe that it's that emotional connection that people make with something like the scent of sage or the beauty of an evening primrose when it unfurls in the evening and the sphinx moths come. If they can get that connection, that emotional connection, then they're going to be more inclined to do the right thing when faced with the choice of, do I pour concrete or do I put down mulch and put in a border of plants?
Now, sometimes we're pushed to action through negative consequences, as in the drought. And you work at the wonderful Theodore Payne Foundation. Has there been an uptick of interest in native plants just simply because of the drought?
There's been a huge uptick, and what people are always so amazed to discover and heartened to discover is that by planting native plants, and having a native garden, you're not only using up to 80% less water in your garden, but you're also helping to save different kinds of species of butterflies and birds, because the native plants are what they need. Most people have no idea that most caterpillars of most butterflies in the southern half of our state can only eat just a couple of native plant species for each kind of caterpillar. And so if you plant the native plants, then you feed the caterpillars, and then you get butterflies. And then if you have caterpillars, then you support birds, because Evolved with stories for millions of years, stories for group cohesion, stories for group survival, stories to celebrate things that are important in life. Yeah, I think stories are essential because that's what people have. I mean, like the insects and animals have evolved with the plants and need the plants. People need stories.
Kate, I love your idea of telling stories.